Good afternoon. I'm Ken Burton, Police Chief of the City of Columbia Police Department, and I'm going to read you a prepared written statement, and then I'll give you an opportunity to answer some questions. On February 11th, 2010, officers with the Columbia Police Department SWAT team served a search warrant at 1501 Kinloch Court in Columbia. This case has stirred the emotions of many people for many different reasons. Before publicly sharing the findings of this internal investigation, I feel compelled to provide some context from a police officer's view. Many people believe that marijuana should be legalized, and I would imagine that some police officers might even agree with you. Right now, it is illegal to distribute marijuana and to possess it. Police officers are expected to enforce the laws whether they are popular or not. We are not here to stand in the way of any citizen from approaching his or her senators or representatives at the state or federal level. There are also many different opinions about what constitutes aggressive behavior on the part of an animal, in this case, 2 dogs. The officers in question were there that evening. The rest of us were not. They had to evaluate the dogs face to face and assess the behaviors they were exhibiting and determine what those behaviors might mean. Several people have referred to the SWAT officers as armored, and so they don't understand how an aggressive dog could possibly pose a threat. Even in full SWAT gear, there are many parts of an officer's body that would remain at risk to a biting animal. Also, having to divert their attention away from the matter at hand to deal with the animal creates a risk that simply cannot be minimized once entry is initiated. The entry itself and the bigger picture of this particular search warrant are things we must discuss as well. Many people have expressed concern that since the officers found a small amount of marijuana and drug paraphernalia, that the basis for establishing probable cause for this warrant was flawed. However, the probable cause affidavit states that we had information that the defendant had a large amount of high-grade marijuana in the home. This information was presented to a judge who concluded it was sufficient to establish probable cause to search the residence for evidence of drug trafficking. It's very important that I talk with you about the actual service of the warrant. I have already stated that even though it is clearly within the confines of the law, the long-time CPD practice of waiting for days after obtaining a warrant and then using dynamic entry to serve it is unacceptable. The day after this incident in February, I took immediate action to ensure that the practice of waiting on those warrants ceased. Since then, I have continued to review our practices. We must consider the presence of children and animals when evaluating the risks involved in the use of a dynamic entry. This is one of the areas where I have made adjustments. We want the citizens of Columbia to know that this investigation was initiated by our own department. We realize that while people have waited for the outcome of the investigation, they have questioned our policies and our practices. I want the people of this community to know that I will continually review our department's policies and practices so that they best serve our citizens and our officers alike. And so we as a department, I as the police chief, initiated this investigation to determine the following 2 things. 1, were the actions of the police officers involved within Columbia Police Department policy, and were they appropriate, based on all the information the officers had available to them at that time. These are the only criteria by which the actions of these officers can be evaluated fairly. And second, did any of our policies or practices put our officers, the defendant, or his family at unnecessary risk? Was this an example of what we call best practices? Did we as a department do anything wrong in preparing for and choosing to serve this warrant? Should we do things differently in the future? I have 2 very different answers to those 2 very different issues. To answer question 1, were the actions of the officers on scene appropriate based on policy, law, and what they knew at the time? The answer is yes. Based on the facts in this investigation, I have concluded that the actions of the officers were within Columbia Police Department policy and state law regarding the use of force against the animals. The dog described as a pit bull exhibited aggressive behavior toward the officers 3 times during the very short time it took them to enter the residence and gain control. We'll discuss this in more detail when I cover the investigative findings for you. To answer question 2, should we do things differently in the future so this doesn't happen again? Yes. In your packet, there are 3 items, and there'll be packets made available to you at the conclusion of the press conference. In your packet, there will be 3 items in addition to a copy of these comments. One is a news release which includes the summary of the investigation and the findings. One is a departmental directive outlining the changes I have made, and one is a summary of the video that we took to record the service of the search warrant. I want to speak briefly about these items and then take questions. We want to assure the citizens who have heard misinformation that some of what they heard about this incident is simply not true. Neither dog was confined. Neither dog was shot in front of or near the people in the house. This happened at 8:30 p.m. in the evening, not in the middle of the night. Officers did not break in. The door was actually unlocked and no force was used on the door. And the search warrant was not issued for a misdemeanor amount of marijuana. However, one of the rumors was correct. It was the truth. And I'm going to tell you about it. A Columbia resident, a neighbor of the defendant, called the police department to ask what was going on. Why were shots fired in the neighborhood? And that person was not answered honestly. Why? And what have we done about that? When the neighbor called to ask about what was happening, the call was given to a young officer who had no knowledge about the search warrant. We're still finalizing the separate investigation into this, but he definitely told the caller bad information. He said something to the effect of this being a training exercise or drill, and that was simply untrue. As I said, that is being handled as a separate investigation itself, and it is being dealt with through our disciplinary process. It is never okay to tell law-abiding citizen bad information. So let me discuss the investigative findings with you. You will find a summary in your packets, a summary of the video that we took, and that most, if not all of you have seen, is included in your packets. The investigation began in February. The officers knew a child was present. They did not know dogs were present. The officers' decisions were based on the safety priorities they are taught to adhere to. Both dogs presented either a threat to the officers or a substantial tactical obstacle initially. The first dog retreated and then no longer posed a threat or tactical obstacle. The other dog did not retreat and continued to pose a threat or substantial tactical obstacle. Please look at the summary of the investigative findings for more details, as well as the video summary. Finally, let me go over the changes we've made and what we have yet to do. From now on, Bureau commanders or the investigative commander will make the decision about whether or not a narcotic search warrant will be served dynamically, and the manner in which it will be served is their sole discretion. This means the captain will receive a briefing about the warrant, review all intelligence related to the warrant. This will include an assessment of all potential dangers to the suspects and officers and any innocent, uninvolved people. And the captain must clearly identify what the law enforcement purpose of serving that warrant is. When officers with our department have established probable cause to obtain a search warrant, they will keep the address under surveillance. If the surveillance is interrupted, they won't serve the warrant, or they may have to serve it in a different manner. In other words, non-dynamically. Surveillance must include all available information, to include the presence of children and animals. Policy has been changed to state that narcotic search warrants must be served within 8 hours of receiving the warrant. If 8 hours pass, the service of the warrant must be approved and reevaluated through the deputy chief or his designee. Dynamic entry into a residence will be restricted. Dynamic entry is a very intrusive way to serve a search warrant, and less intrusive ways must be considered first. Our policy regarding the use of paid informants to establish any element of probable cause to search a private residence is being reviewed. The investigative commander will be taking a more active role and will routinely audit every informant in those transactions. Officers will identify and obtain arrest warrants to be served in conjunction with search warrants whenever possible. Helmet cameras are being purchased for every member of the SWAT team's entry team, and it will be required that they be in operation if they're on a warrant. To summarize, the Columbia Police Department has a very lengthy and structured SWAT manual outlining search warrant service along with other operational guidelines, their mission and philosophy, as well as technical components such as equipment and training. What I know as the chief is that while our SWAT members are well trained and are held to strict guidelines, we have utilized SWAT routinely in circumstances and situations where we should not. We have utilized dynamic entries in circumstances and situations where we should not. This practice has now changed. The change is for the benefit of our citizens and of our officers. In addition, narcotic units detectives work very diligently and thoroughly on their investigations. What happened in this incident shows very clearly that there was not the necessary coordination between divisions. We had a good investigation that culminated in the detectives receiving a search warrant. Then the timing of the search warrant fell in the hands of another group of officers. That is not acceptable. We did not coordinate this properly as a department, and that will not happen again. Sometimes a crisis provides the impetus and the opportunity to change. The best you can do is seize those opportunities. I'll now take your questions.
Chief, is there anything that you went over several things here, but what would you say is the main thing that you would not do again?
The main thing would be not to wait that amount of time. We need to act on the probable cause that we have, and I'll tell you, those officers' intentions were honorable. They believed that distribution was going on in that home, and we just simply waited too long. Had they entered, I think we'd on the day that we received the warrant, I think we'd have had a completely different outcome.
Is there any disciplinary action against any officer due to this situation?
I anticipate the officer, based on what I know right now, like I told you, it's still in progress, but the officer giving the misinformation to the citizen is going to be reprimanded. Yes, ma'am.
Before this warrant, how long did you, or before the change, how long did you have to carry out a warrant?
The state of Missouri allows 10 days, so you can wait up to 10, and in this case, we waited 8. Yes, sir.
Not in this incident, but have you ever used this kind of entry on a misdemeanor related offense?
Not
Stated
knowing.
on the police report itself?
That's a good question, not knowingly. Occasionally, we will have information that we're going in for a felony or a serious offense, and then the result is that the arrest is made for a misdemeanor because there's not a felony amount there.
But at any point, do they get a warrant on the misdemeanor?
And serve dynamically, no.
How can you call it a good investigation when you in fact didn't even know there were animals in the house?
No, but were you here for the whole conference? We admit that. We didn't know there were animals in the house. We didn't have the house under surveillance.
Turned
That's
right
what we're
around at the
changing.
end and said that you had a good investigation, but the only reason that you didn't get what you claimed was because you waited.
That's correct.
So, not knowing what all's in the house to encounter is good investigation.
Yeah, I think we're just missing each other here. The night, if we had served the warrant the day we had the investigation, the outcome would have been much different. Whether the dogs were there or not, we weren't really looking into that, or whether there were children present prior to that. We are now.
So like, where was the garage area of the house located in relationship to the kitchen area?
Okay, I wasn't at the warrant service, so I can't really answer that question for you.
Yeah, you're just saying that, you know, there was no one near the area, but what about the area on the other end? I mean, just because they were in the other side of the house, because they not been in the garage? I don't know where that, I've never seen.
If I think where you're going with this is, do we know where everybody was in the house before we went in? No, that's impossible. You would have to have observation through every window of the house. That's not practical.
What kind of ammunition do they use? Do they use, you know, I forget the kind of bullets designed not to go through walls? I mean, a lot of the military assault teams use, they're made, I mean, they're lethal bullets, but they're like Teflon coated birdshot. They're designed not to go through the drywall of the structure itself.
I'd be happy to answer those questions for you at another time. What I'd like to do is focus on what I've talked about here. And I believe you had a question.
I know you keep saying that if you would have served the warrant immediately, you believe the outcome would have been different, but how can you prove that?
Well, I don't know that there's any proof of it other than what the confidential informant was used, said that they saw in the house. You know, that's information that we had that made us believe that there was a felony amount of marijuana in the house. So, you know, I'm just telling you we had that information. Once we ran the warrant, there was also evidence in the house that there was drug trafficking going on. So, the fact that there was none there just means they were out of stock, I guess.
What was that evidence that indicated that there was drug trafficking?
Well, information that we received ahead of time that there were duffel bags in the attic. And we found the duffel bag, and they reeked of marijuana, but there was no marijuana in them. And then the safe that was recovered in the house also reeked of unburned marijuana. So it was the officer's opinion that there had, at least at one time, been large amounts of marijuana in the house, which tended to support what our confidential informant told us. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, are sensory observations legitimate in court, or is that just?
Oh, yes, in fact, a lot of times the smell of marijuana when you roll your window down at a traffic stop, obviously the officer can detect marijuana and through their training can detect marijuana or an illegal substance being used in the car. Yes, that can be established, that can establish probable cause.
And was that the only? I think what was the question again originally about what was the evidence that talked to you?
The evidence of trafficking.
Evidence of trafficking, yes.
Is that the only evidence that you have from that trafficking agent?
I guess I'm missing the question.
Was that the only evidence in answer to his question? Was that all you had that was after the investigation?
And then what the informant saw when they were actually in the house, coupled with that, what we found.
There's nothing that he produced.
I guess I'm not following your question. Okay.
Chief, you mentioned your, oh, go ahead.
If the February 11th incident never happened, do you feel that you would still be making these changes to this policy?
No, because I wouldn't have known about it. Probably we would have gone on serving these warrants until something like this happened and it came to my attention. It is not something that was on my radar. And I want to emphasize that, you know, these officers weren't doing anything wrong. This was a practice that had been in place several years. And like I closed, I said, you know, sometimes things happen and that gives you the impetus for change. And that's one of the things I think that we've benefited from here.
Chief, you mentioned that you're going to get more helmet cameras. How many more cameras are you going to purchase, and do you know the cost of those yet? And when will they be implemented?
Tom can answer that question for you. He's researching that right now.
I believe we're going to purchase 8 cameras. They are digital cameras that are to store the digital information on the chip. The ones we're looking at right now cost a little over $300 each.
Yes, ma'am.
You said that you knew that there was a child present before. What is the protocol, or did it change now, of shooting before you know the location?
Right. Well, the protocol now is that we have to take the presence of that child into consideration. That was not considered something that would prevent us from taking or using a dynamic entry in the past. It is now. I feel it's something that we have to consider. I've discussed it with Tom and the staff, and we realize that, you know, those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to take into consideration before we do a dynamic entry. We've learned some lessons here, folks, and that's what we're trying to tell you today.
I have 2 questions for you, Chief. The first is on the 8 hours. I understand that our SWAT officers are have regular duty, and then are brought together as a team for dynamic entries after a full shift. Is 8 hours really enough for them to have rest and be ready for something as stressful as a dynamic entry? Or would 24 hours not perhaps be a better solution?
Okay. 24 hours was actually considered, but I think there may be some confusion there in that it's not necessarily that the officers we're going to wait 8 hours so they can rest. We have officers that are tactically trained shotgun throughout the department. So we will gather an entry team, and we'll gather officers that are not just getting off work. That's the whole point. I think that there was consideration made for how much overtime it was going to cost, and those kinds of things. People trying to do the right things, but you know, we lose the benefit of having a warrant like this run promptly when we wait too long. The 8-hour window that I chose is primarily so that if we get a warrant at 10 o'clock at night, we're not running at midnight. That gives the officer till 8 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock in the morning to run that warrant. Generally, we want them run as soon as possible, and it has to be at a reasonable hour.
And the second question is sort of from what I've heard from you, and this is an interpretation, so I'd like your confirmation as to how accurate that is. I'm hearing you say that you have concluded that it is appropriate to use dynamic entry when the primary concern is loss of evidence as opposed to imminent danger to the public or to office.
Yes, but it'll be weighed with the, it'll be weighed based on the risk to human life, that of the officers, that of the suspects, that of innocent bystanders. If you're asking me if this warrant would have been run tomorrow, I'm telling you it wouldn't. The standard is much higher, and it has to be. I don't think that we can send the message to people who engage in the narcotics trade that we're out of business. because we're not. We're bound by law to enforce the laws. And so when we have to make one of these entries, what we're doing is raising the bar for what we will consider before we go in. And I will tell you very frankly that we're going to be looking at every possible thing that could go wrong. We'd be very foolish not to.
And is that criteria summarized in the information you said you'd make available on the way out?
It is, but a lot of it is, like I just told you, I don't want, people who engage in illegal activity in the city of Columbia should expect to be arrested. So I'm not going to say that we're not going to arrest people for narcotics. In
But the
fact,
question
quite the
isn't
opposite.
about arrest, of course, it's about dynamic entry, isn't it?
That's correct. And we're going to use alternatives to dynamic entry. And we'll still make those searches. We'll do it in what I would consider a safer and more prudent manner when we detect that there are children present or even with animals present. There's nothing that says we have to run a dynamic entry. And we're taking the approach that if it's not worth it, and let me just kind of expound on this a little bit, maybe you'll understand a little bit better where I'm going with this. My instructions to my staff were is if we run this warrant and something like happened in Detroit a few days ago happens, or one of our police officers is killed making this entry, we need to be able to look back on that and say, that person didn't die for something that wasn't worth it. We really need to examine why we're going in here, what our valid law enforcement purpose is, and we need to do it where it's worthwhile. And by that I mean the threat in the house or the dealer or whatever has to be the kind of threat that we can articulate that we need to deal with this now. And the only way to do it is dynamically. What I'm committing to you is that we're going to use other alternatives. Dynamic entry is going to be a last resort. We can still run search warrants and not run them dynamically. We can run them after the people leave. We can let people leave the home, we can stop them on traffic, arrest them, and then go back and run the warrant. We can wait for kids to go to school on a school bus. There's a lot of things that we can do. We can wait till people let their dogs out to go to the bathroom. I mean, and we're going to look at it that closely. That's the whole point of having the place under surveillance, so that we're aware to the best of our ability of what's going on. And can I assure you that we won't shoot another dog? I can't tell you that. I can't control what these dogs are going to do when we get there, but we're going to do what we can. We're not going to go in there again and say, we didn't consider that. Yes, ma'am.
What kind of consequences would officers face if the protocol wasn't followed, this new protocol that you developed?
Well, it would be everything up from being disciplined with time off to being terminated. And I guess that would be dependent on the rank of the officer. If it's a bad decision, I think that it's based on, we do the best we can, and when people are cutting corners, I can tell you right now, most of my staff's here, they're not going to cut any corners. I've made it perfectly clear, and they're in agreement. I think that's important, is that those commanders understand they didn't want this to happen either. It did. We all want to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Chief, I know you've got.
Yes, sir.
How confident are you that a change in policy will create a change in practice?
I am confident that the message I am sending to the department will cause substantive change in the way we handle these incidents. Folks, my department has gone through officers who weren't even involved, are being pilloried, in the media, people they encounter on the streets. I mean, it's not been pleasant for us either. We don't want it to happen again, any more than some of you do. So we're doing what we can within the parameters of the law, and I think we're even going above and beyond and trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. We don't want a similar incident. Yes, sir.
Chief, I know you've gotten a lot of feedback from the public, but have you been in touch with other police departments and speaking with them about this issue?
Absolutely. In fact, one of my assignments to Deputy Chief Dresner was to look at what other departments are doing as far as other options for dealing with animals on warrants. We're going to learn what we can from other agencies. And best practices are out there. We intend to adopt them. So, yeah, we're going to ask other people. We're going to ask anybody who has an educated opinion. Yes, sir.
This is, by my account, the third press conference in 3 weeks or less on this. Are you at the point now where you anticipate further changes or adjustments to the policy as it evolves, or are you kind of at the point now where it's time to move forward and see where we go from here?
No, I think what I have implemented here is a climate of looking at what we're doing every time we do it, particularly as it relates to uses of force and things that got me before you today. And looking at those things critically on an ongoing basis. We can't afford to say, okay, this is the policy and we're going to live with it. We may have to make other changes to it. And hopefully it's not, we're doing it because of its best practices, and we're looking to do the best things, and that's our intent. Some of those things are going to slip by. We don't want another impetus to have to make changes like this again. We'd rather do it on our own. So we're going to be looking internally at our policies and our procedures, looking for best practices. As you know, I've asked the Police Civilian Review Board to review our policy. Their recommendations were welcome. And they may give us more fodder for thought for looking at other policies. And I have no issue with that. We will always try to, obviously my primary responsibility is the public and my officers. I don't want anybody getting hurt, even somebody engaging in illegal activity. So I see this as positive steps in that direction to try to make sure those things don't happen.
Chief, do you?
Yes, sir.
Chief, 5 years ago, I think you're aware of this before you came, 61% of the voters in the city voted to make marijuana law enforcement the lowest priority. That was amended by the council to say it should be among the lower priorities, but that is the law in this city. That's the law on the books in this city at this time. Does that have any effect on the policy of the department? Does that impact in any way what you all do?
You know, I'm going to be very frank with you. I'm not sure how to accomplish what the ordinance says. I think that if I have a choice between, I'm a police officer out on the street, and I have a choice between catching somebody breaking into a warehouse and cleaning it out and arresting somebody, and I'm assuming you're talking for a misdemeanor amount of marijuana.
Well, it doesn't say misdemeanor, it says marijuana law enforcement.
You know, I think my answer to you has to be that those more than misdemeanor amounts of marijuana are going to have to be made not a violation of state law. And I applaud your efforts. I mean, you know, if we could get out of the business, I think there are a lot of police officers that would be happy to do that. Unfortunately, it is still a matter of law, and the shooting that happened right after the week right after this kind of came to the forefront was over marijuana. You know, so crimes of violence do occur because of marijuana. It's not. And you may make the argument that it's because it's not legal. Hey, you may be right. I don't have anything against it except that it's against the law. And as a police officer, I've sworn to uphold the law. And so prioritizing when we can, you're absolutely right. I think that we should concentrate on maybe methamphetamine or something like that that's more serious. But if we come across marijuana, it's still against the law. So I'm with you on the fight. I hope you're successful at some point, and we'll see how that goes. Yes, sir.
Do you think these policy changes are enough to satisfy the citizens, and if not, are you willing to make more? And then I had another question: is who will be paying for these new helmet cameras? Would that be the citizens, or will that be coming out of the police department's pocket?
Well, of course, it'd be paid for out of the police department pocket, but it comes right through yours. You're a citizen of this city, and if you pay taxes, that's where we get our money. So yeah, citizens would be paying for it. But it's something that Tom and I have talked about, and we think that, what got us here was videotaping this one part of this. Our feeling from the beginning is what happened inside that house would be much clearer had all those officers had video cams where we could look at their point of view, what they were actually seeing. And, it'll give us more ability to review these cases after the fact and make improvements to how we do business.
As a citizen, I've become more and more concerned about the erosion of our civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, is it or is it not a violation of one's civil rights with the knock and announce warrant to not give them a chance to open the door?
No, it is not.
So
it is not.
The fact that that's versus Michigan Supreme Court rule that the violation upon entry is not enough to get evidence suppressed. in a criminal offense.
I would recommend to you that your argument's not with me. You know, if the law changes and they make me aware of it, then that's what we'll enforce. Somebody
Chief,
else
I was
has a
just
question?
wondering if you feel there's a need for a public apology because of this incident.
I think that I actually have no issue with apologizing for what happened that night, as long as it's made clear that the officers were acting under what they believed was proper protocol and procedure. So I guess what I would apologize for is that I didn't see the procedural things that I would have changed sooner. The unfortunate part about it was we seldom do until something happens, and that requires us to look at things a little bit harder. My staff and I are working very hard to make the Columbia Police Department one of the best departments in the country. We don't want this kind of thing to tarnish our image or our reputation. And we want the citizens of this city to believe we're one of the best police departments in the country. And I can tell you that the men and women of this department are working very hard to get us there. And the ones that, I'm not naive, there may be officers out there, there's bad apples in every basket. And my commitment to you is to ferret those out and get rid of them because we don't need them. But our department, the command staff of this department, do not want this to happen again. And I think if I left you with anything, I'd want the public to hear that, is that they do not want this to happen again. So trust in the command staff. I wish this was a perfect world, and I can tell you it never will, but we'll never make another mistake. The reality is we're likely to. My commitment to you is that we're going to try to detect the things that may make us make mistakes ahead of time and fix them before they happen. We're not always going to be able to do that. Sometimes I'm going to stand before you and I'm going to say we made a mistake. We're fixing it.
Chief, can the results of these findings of this investigation, both, I guess, into this specific incident and into departmental policy about use of force, can these both be reviewed by the Citizens Review Board?
If I'm understanding your question, you're saying the investigation itself and the new policy?
Right. I mean, the Citizens Review Board can review department policy, but I guess my question is, can the review board now review results of the investigation into Mr. Whitworth's?
That's a good question, but and I have to tell you, we've not received a complaint from the Whitworths or anybody else involved with this. I initiated the complaint myself. So the way I understand the policy is that if the person making the complaint is dissatisfied with my decision, then they can appeal to the Civilian Review Board. At this point, I'm the complainant. Nobody else has come forward. So unless I'm unhappy with my own decision, I don't know how it would get there. But I think that the City Council has made it very clear they want to look at it. And obviously, if they tell me they want the Civilian Review Board to look at it, it's an open book. They're welcome to.
I was just trying to confirm that. I had the same reading of the law, but I did have one point of clarification because I was looking at the statute. Under the statute's definite terms, a complainant can be a person who files a complaint with the police department against an officer. There's no specific language in there about someone having to be involved with the incident.
And we're taking all those complaints, and everybody that sent us a complaint saying they didn't like this will get a response as to my decision. What I'm saying is, I'm not sure what the legal basis for the appeal would be if you weren't there and you didn't know what really happened. And unfortunately, that's one of those things that, one of the reasons we have a Civilian Review Board is that people feel like that our version is the only version out there. In this case, I don't know what else I would do. I'm telling you that we've looked at it, we've kicked over every rock and everything that we could think of that we could have done better, and we've admitted it to you. So I welcome them to look at it. If they choose to do that and they can get it through the ordinance somehow, then I would support that. Yes, Brent?
The second internal investigation, was that initiated by a complainant or by the department?
The second one on the officer who...
At the scene, who said that... it
was a drill?
It was a drill.
Actually, that came from the citizen. How that all played out is the 911 operator said, I'll have an officer call you. This officer called, really wasn't sure what he could say or couldn't say, so he said something that wasn't true. And we had a supervisor, in fact, the SWAT commander called back and told the citizen what had occurred. And until it came up here, I think, at the Civilian Police Review Board, and that became an issue, then we made it an issue. Obviously, we heard somebody had told a citizen something that was untrue, and we looked into it. And sure enough, right, that citizen was satisfied with the explanation of the supervisor. We still went in there and said, hey, why'd you do this? And it was simply a young officer and didn't know what to say. You know, I know that I have to be careful with what I say as far as suspects, and this could be a suspect I'm talking to, I don't know. So he was careful to the point of saying something untrue. My philosophy is you just tell people, I don't know. I'll find somebody that will call you back that does know. And that's good enough for citizens most of the time. But it was just not appropriate for him to say untrue. Any other media questions? Yes, ma'am.
You said that this happened because you didn't know about the procedure before and it's hard to know. Is there any protocol for when the chief first comes into position for checking procedures? And in addition to dynamic entry, which is what you revised, are you going to look into any of your other protocol procedures?
I'd almost like to put that question to my staff, because I've done nothing but answer questions over the past year, or ask questions over the past year. And I'll state publicly that I have not been easy on them. There are things that I thought needed immediate change. And I'm very proud to say that a lot of things that I asked them to do, they didn't believe in. But they're standing behind me now. And, excuse me. I'm not easy to work for. I'm very demanding. I insist on excellence, and the people standing in this room right here are excellent, excellent people. Next question.
Yes, sir. Still a lot of information about locking the dog. I'm just kind of curious about the approximate age of the pit, and the fact that the report says that they encountered the dogs at the front door, but you reported to us just now that the dogs refused to retreat.
What I would suggest to you folks, and you've got some questions that are valid questions, and I know they are, I'm not trying to put you off, but we're going to post this on the internet along with all the documents related to this incident. At your leisure, go in there, look at it. You have further questions, call me. Call me, and I'll do my best to answer your questions or your concerns. We're putting it all out there. It'll all be on the city's website. Go on there along with the documents. Jesse, what all else are we putting out there? Everything.
The new guidelines, policy changes, complete copy of the chief's written statement today, a news release summarizing the event as well as the investigative findings, and a play-by-play of that video so that you'll be able to look at that and see exactly how all that transpired. It'll all be on the website at gocolumbiamo.com.
Brent?
There's been a lot of talk about the informants. You told us today about the bags in the attic and the safe. Why release that information now and not 2 weeks ago to reassure residents concerning your use of informants?
Well, I'll tell you why. Because a person is innocent until they're proven guilty. And we repeatedly got the same questions. I'm not about slandering anybody. We went in there with a probable cause warrant for a felony amount of marijuana. That's all I can tell you. We didn't find it. We found evidence that it had been there at one time. And, I answered that in response to a question. My PIO told me, if you're asked, say it. And so I did. And there's a lot of things that we're not interested in slandering anybody. As far as we're concerned, that criminal case is closed, done, over. And if, God forbid another case came up that involved Mr. Whitworth, I don't ever want to be accused of trying to put him in a bad spot. He's came in, he paid his fine for what he was charged with, and he went on down the road. So I think we ought to let him do that. Yes.
Just wanted to clarify one last time. So you made changes to the decision-making process and on surveillance and like that commit to dynamic entry, but is there an actual articulable change in policy for when the SWAT team goes in the door, they encounter a dog or suspect that there may be in the house? I mean, has any of that changed?
We can't. That is all based on the safety of the officers and the people involved. I can tell you that I fully expect the number of dynamic entries that we conduct in the city of Columbia is going to plummet. I think that we'll use alternative methods of running these warrants that are less intrusive, and it'll be, I'll just tell you, if we run a dynamic warrant, it's going to be because we had to. That was the last resort, and that was the only way we could figure to get in there and do what we needed to do. Yes, sir?
I have one last question. I don't know the whole case. From what I was understood, that the warrant was obtained through a trash board and just informant information alone. Is there going to be any changes to where you need more information than just from what a confidential informant in the trash bowl is to go into somebody's house?
As I said in my statement, we were reviewing the practice of paid informants. And I'll be straight up with you. I want to, I think paying for information in some ways taints it in some cases. And I think that my staff has heard that we're going to be much more careful about that. And as I said, the Bureau Commander is going to be reviewing those, that informant policy, when we pay, how much we pay, and why. And that's going to be, it's just going to have to be tightened up.
Does that include paying them by dismissing or reducing charges against them?
Well, you know, I can't speak for the prosecutor. That would be a decision, joint decision between what we had as far as charges against this person and what the prosecutor was willing to do. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if they give us major crime information and it's a relatively minor offense the prosecutor is willing to trade out, that we're not going to take advantage of that. We still have to do law enforcement, and we will continue to do that.
Can I say something real quick? To answer yours a little bit further, I think one of the things that's occurred is that the public assumes from everything that they've seen so far that what was in that search warrant affidavit is all we had. And that's not true.
Yeah,
That's
like
the
I said,
minimum
I
that
don't
we
know.
knew that would be required based on past practice for that to occur. The assumption shouldn't be made that that's all it is.
Yeah, and like I said, I didn't know the whole information. I was just asking.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You had just said you expect a number of dynamic entries in Columbia to plummet. We haven't seen from the news media coverage so far what those statistics are like. Do you have that information? Could you make that available on the city website for us
We have
at
those
some time
numbers,
in the
too.
near
We'll put
future?
them together.
Thank you.
And, you know, I have noticed there was a couple of suggestions that I'm still pondering that were made during the Police Civilian Review Board meeting. That should we publicly say what we did every month, how many we ran a month? I don't have an issue with it. And if that's something that we need to post on the website, and then if it raises a flag with somebody, they can sure give me a call. I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to ebb and flow. I mean, you know, sometimes they'll go up, sometimes they'll go down with no rational explanation. But we're happy to share that information, and it is public information. Based on the suggestions from there, I think we're going to do that. Monthly, quarterly, just like we do use of force and things like that. Yes, sir.
Assistant Chief Dresner was nice enough to answer some reader concerns on our message board at ColumbiaMissourian.com last week. It raised a couple of questions for me real quick. You had implied
That's not supposed to happen.
Oh, sorry, but I read on me.
I know.
I have to moderate them. One of the things you had suggested was that the second dog was not a corgi. Did you ever determine what the breed of the second dog was?
I'm not an animal expert. All I can tell you is that we have photographs. I think those have been sunshine. We looked at the photograph. It's completely unscientific. It doesn't look anything like a corgi does.
Okay.
I read that someone commented that it was half box.
There was a what?
Half box.
Half box.
One of the comments stated that.
That sounds a whole lot closer. And I think you'll be able to see for yourself eventually.
Okay. And regarding those same photos that you had also alluded to in some of your comments on our site, you had suggested that there were photos that would show that neither dog was caged or otherwise restrained, despite what several of the other readers on the board were saying that the dogs were restrained. Are those photos going to be part of the packet that's available online later today? Or?
Yeah, I don't think we're planning on releasing those as part of this overall thing. I think those are going out in response to Sunshine, which may gather some steam now. But there's always going to be skeptics. There were about 30 photos taken at the time of the scene, I think. Just looking at the CD when I brought it up on my computer, and that's all there are. Was every square inch of the kitchen photographed so that you could see there was no cages in there? No, but those dogs were not caged. And at some point, I think you've got to take us at our word, and we realize that the public's trust, especially in this age of the demand for instant answers and instant justification, we're not able to do that on that timeline.
I have just a simple question about the fact that the more commonplace is the evidence found in trash, and in fact that Columbia does have medical cannabis clause, and the fact how that relate to, say, if someone may be a possible medical cannabis patient, and there was evidence found in the trash, and how the policy might reflect upon how you might go about things differently in that manner.
Well, I think that's part of the investigative process. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that our narcotics investigators do actually consider that. And they just to try to find out if that is the case. I can't promise you that, but
Yeah,
you
just
bring
see
up a
the
good
fact
point.
that it could cause a situation like this to maybe possibly happen again in the future, just for the fact that they're medical, they're not going to be concerned about what they put in the trash.
If it's a medical amount of marijuana, I don't think they would have the
Yeah, I
kind
mean,
of
like,
quantities we would be
like
talking about.
bags or whatever.
Sure.
Chief?
Yes.
I think we need to devote a whole day to you.
Let you ask
I'm
questions.
serious. Come see. I'll devote a whole day to answering your question.
Chief, well, how you holding up over all this? I mean, it's been stressful.
You know, I'm fine. My wife says that I appear pretty resilient. You know, I'm fine. I feel for the men and women that still have to go out there, you know, and wear this uniform every day, and know that there are people out there that don't like them, and people that you know, some of the things that were said to my officers obviously hurt me, and if it hurts them, then it hurts me. You know, it's kind of like your kids. But we're going to be fine. We're going to be fine. We're going to make the changes. We're listening to the community, and we're listening to what is of concern to the community, and we're going to do our level best to still enforce the law in this city within those parameters. And I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. Sometimes I'm going to have to tell you, no, I didn't do that. But I think we've done a lot to move toward what Columbia wants us doing as it relates to these warrants, the dynamically served warrants. And so I think we've reached the point where I've done all I can and not compromise the safety of the officers or the citizens involved. And so there's a point where I can't go any further. But I'll go as far as I can. And I think we've done that. Any other questions? I apologize for getting a little emotional there a minute ago, but it's worn on all of us. It's worn on all of us.
Were officers
Yes.
allowed to comment on the various message boards, or are they told not to, or is it command staff only, or?
Actually, I tell Tom not to. I said, you know, just don't get involved in the fray.
Some people like it, I suppose.
But I believe that's
Seems more forthcoming.
a free speech thing. You know, I'm not going to tell officers.
There's no policy that says, please don't comment on the message boards under even.
You know, this is new. We've never really had to ask that question. I would, if an officer asked me, kind of what Tom said, I said, identify yourself as Tom Dresden. So either that, or it be completely anonymous where nobody knows who you are, and don't identify yourself as an anonymous Columbia police officer. That's the only lines I would draw.
Yeah, I don't think the comment board's been up very long, has it, on the Tribune?
I don't know.
Last year?
I'm surprised it hasn't crashed over this.
I mean, I don't think it's even been up a year or so.
But I think they're, Tom says they're wonderful. I won't read them. I just can't bring myself to. But
No, I don't know that I use the term wonderful.
but he does, and I think that's an officer's right to free speech, and they have that right just like any other citizen. So I would not feel right in saying no to them in that regard, except they keep the department out of it. Don't represent themselves as a police officer. Any other questions? Okay, Jesse's got packets for you guys from the media there. And again, it's on the website. Everything that we release today will be on the web here in the next hour or so, I guess. Right, Jesse?
I'm sorry?
Next hour?
Yes.
You bet.
No, I just some concerns.
Okay. Everyone good? Sure. Well, my secretary's name is Mary. You'll most likely get her. So just tell her we talked to you. Okay. You bet.
I know, we had lunch with her.
Did you?
Yeah,
Oh.
we did.
You got to see her more than I did.
What's her name again? Nice to see you. Hopefully we'll see her again. We're doing it once weekend, but hopefully,
Right.
you know, post that will be a good.
Well, I'm glad you got to eat lunch with her more than I did.
Huh? I know, I'm gonna miss her.
She said they bought her Panera bread.
I mean, even though I you watch me.
They got her Panera bread,
She said it was a really good last day. She said that.
what do you call, bagels.